In the days when hanging was the punishment for murder, a wrongful conviction could never be undone. 10 Rillington Place in London was the setting for a shocking series of murders and an equally momentous miscarriage of justice. This film reopens the casebook on a serial killer who buried his victims around his house in West London. A tin filled with pubic hairs and bones of his victims are vivid reminders of one of Britain's most appalling crimes. Perhaps more has been written about the killings at 10 Rillington Place than any other mass homicide in Britain. 7 people were killed there in the 1940s, and it took around 20 years to pardon the man wrongly hanged for 2 of the murders. 1949, and parts of London had been bombed almost out of recognition. The exhilaration of wartime victory had been followed by the austerity of post-war reconstruction. The scarcity of housing caused by the Blitz meant that living conditions were cramped and often debilitated. Overcrowding was typically acute in Notting Hill, and at 10 Rillington Place, 3 flats were crammed into a small Victorian house. It became the most notorious address of its age. It was here that a mother and baby were murdered, it seemed by the husband and father, Timothy Evans. He was found guilty of the murders and hanged at Pentonville Prison in February 1950. Evans had been born in Wales in November 1924 into a Roman Catholic family. He was unable to read or write, but he worked hard as a painter and decorator, although his young mind was full of fantasies.
Here was a man who lied repeatedly to all of his friends, who was known as a compulsive liar and boaster, who made the most ridiculous, fantastic claims about being the son of an Italian count and having a brother who had a fleet of limousines and so on.
He married a local girl, Beryl Thorley, in September 1947. They moved to the top floor flat at 10 Rillington Place 7 months later and had their first child, a baby girl called Geraldine. In the summer of 1949, Beryl became pregnant again, but this time she was horrified. She was only 19. They'd no money to support another child, and she was determined to have an abortion, much to Timothy's disgust. But Beryl was adamant. Later that year, Evans's mother became concerned that she'd not heard from Tim for several weeks.
He'd fled London because he lost his job and went to Merthyr Vale, which was his home, stayed with his aunt and uncle. And after 2 weeks, it became clear that something odd had happened. His mother had written to his aunt saying we haven't heard hide and a hair of him for 2 weeks. So the uncle and aunt confronted Timothy with this, and he went to the police station. Timothy Evans came forward and volunteered the information that his wife was dead and that he had disposed of her down a drain. The police in Notting Hill soon solved the problem by coming round, taking up the manhole cover. It took 3 men to lift the manhole cover, so it's quite ludicrous for a thin, weedy person like Timothy Evans to claim that he could have done it. Well, the body wasn't there.
Beryl and Geraldine were still missing at this point. Then Evans changed his statement. He blamed the murders entirely on another resident from Rillington Place, a man called John Reginald Christie.
John Christie was a very tall, thin man, and everyone commented on the fact that he had this strange whisper, because he lost his voice through mustard gas in the First World War, and these piercing eyes. He was highly respectable, with a good record. He'd fought in the First World War. He'd been a policeman during the Second World War. The last person one would suspect of a crime.
While living at Rillington Place, the Evanses and the Christies struck up a friendship, and the 2 wives enjoyed each other's company. Timothy claimed Christie had heard that Beryl was seeking an abortion, and convinced them that he had the medical qualifications to carry out such an operation. Evans added that when he came back from work, Christie had told him the procedure had gone horribly wrong. Beryl was dead.
The police go to John Christie and challenge him. He appeared as a perfectly reasonable man who was outraged at the suggestion that he was in any way involved. And he says, no, I've been extremely good to the Evanses over there, and why should I be involved in an abortion?
After searching Rillington Place, police discovered the bodies in the washroom. Beryl Evans was wrapped in a tablecloth behind a stack of wood. Baby Geraldine was found behind the door with a tie around her neck. Both had been strangled.
They have an open and shut case. Here is a man who is very quarrelsome, very volatile, who is known to argue with his wife and resort to violence from time to time, who they think has killed his wife, and a few days later, because his daughter was crying a great deal, killed her as well, put them both in the washhouse before, and then fled the scene of the crime.
Evans was brought back to London 3 weeks before Christmas in 1949, and his trial started early in the new year at the Old Bailey. He was charged with the murder of his daughter.
In those days, the law would only allow someone to be tried for one murder at a time. Now, clearly there was slightly more evidence for the murder of the wife, but there was also a possibility, if the prosecution pursued that line, that he could claim provocation by the wife. With the child, of course, there could be no provocation because a defenceless child of 18 months, poor Geraldine, couldn't be seen in that particular way.
The jury took only 40 minutes to weigh the evidence. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence, death by hanging.
When the verdict was given, Timothy Evans was too numb to react in any sort of way. It was John Christie who reacted. He actually burst into tears. And as he left the court, Mrs. Probert, who was Timothy Evans' mother, called him a murderer. And Mrs. Christie said, "My husband is a good, honest man."
Evans was adamant that he was innocent and that Christie was the killer. An appeal was lodged on his behalf.
He persisted in claiming his innocence, told his mother and all the family who came to see him that he was innocent. He was Roman Catholic, and he took confession with the chaplain, and he went to his death still saying that he was innocent.
Having lost his appeal, on the 9th of March at 8 o'clock in the morning, Timothy Evans was hanged. Three years later, John Christie had a disagreement with his landlord at Rillington Place. And after 15 years in the property, he left the premises for good. With Christie gone, another tenant, Beresford Brown, is given access to Christie's kitchen. He wants to put a radio on the wall. That needs a shelf. And so he discovers it's hollow when it ought to have been brick. Astonished, he drops his tools and decides to peel away the wallpaper. And there, quite plainly, is a door. Eventually, he manages to pull the door a little bit ajar, and inside, there's a body. Had Evans committed yet more murders, or was there another killer in Rillington Place? Mother and daughter, Beryl and Geraldine Evans, have been found murdered in the washroom of 10 Rillington Place in West London. Timothy Evans, the husband and father, initially admitted the killings according to police, but later changed his statement to implicate another resident from Rillington Place, John Christie. There was no evidence against Christie, and the police were convinced that Evans was the culprit. Timothy Evans was tried for the murder of his baby daughter and was executed at Pentonville Prison in March 1950. But 3 years later, John Christie moved out of Rillington Place after a disagreement with the landlord. A man called Beresford Brown took over the flat, and while putting up some brackets on the kitchen wall, he found a hidden door. Behind the door, there was a body. So the police are called to 10 Rillington Place. They look through the crack in the door and they see the body. What happens next?
They open the door and they see not one, not two, but three bodies, three female bodies, which had been kept in there for some time and hadn't decomposed too much because we're talking about winter, 1953, which was quite a harsh winter, and therefore that delayed decomposition.
The first woman found in the alcove was Hectorina MacLennan, a mother of two from Scotland. She was attached by her bra straps to a blanket which was wrapped around Rita Nelson, a prostitute from Belfast. Behind them was Kathleen Maloney, another prostitute, who was covered in a woolen blanket and tied at the ankles with a plastic flex. All three women had been strangled.